Now, you've probably all heard the phrase, the expression, terra nullius, nobody's land. That's what Captain Cook and his cronies dubbed Australia. It wasn't known as Australia in those days. When they arrived, nobody's land. Nothing could be further from the truth, as we are about to find out over the next couple of days. I'm sure a lot of you have already read certain things in Nexus, but I think we're going to open your eyes with some of our wonderful speakers, their presentations, what they're going to show us, what they're going to talk about, and their presentations. Really fantastic presenters. So I know you're going to really get a lot out of this conference. Now, our first speaker, Bill Gammage, the author of The Biggest Estate on Earth, a book that explodes the myth that pre-settlement Australia was an untamed wilderness, revealing the complex countrywide systems of land management used by the First Nation people. For over a decade, Bill has examined, written and visually recorded the Australian landscape. He has uncovered an extraordinary complex system of land management using fire and the life cycles of native plants to ensure plentiful wildlife and plant foods throughout the year. We know that Aboriginal people spent far less time and effort than Europeans in securing food and shelter, and now we know why and how they did it. With details of land management strategies from around Australia, The Biggest Estate on Earth rewrites the history of this continent with huge implications for all of us today. Once Aboriginal people were no longer able to tend their country, it became overgrown and vulnerable to the hugely damaging bushfires that we are now experiencing, and they seem to be getting worse and worse every year. And now what we think of as virgin bush in a national park is nothing of the kind, as we're about to find out. Bill Gammage is an historian and Emeritus Professor in the Humanities Research Centre at the Australian National University in Canberra. He researched Aboriginal land management at the time of British contact, 1788, which resulted in the publishing of his book, The Biggest Estate on Earth. Bill actually grew up in Wagga and went to Wagga Wagga High School and was an ANU undergraduate and postgraduate before teaching history at the universities of Papua New Guinea and also Adelaide. He was also historical advisor to an iconic film, Peter Weir's iconic film, which is Gallipoli. I guess most of you have seen Gallipoli somewhere along the line, either as a movie or on TV or whatever. Great movie. Bill was also advisor on several documentaries. He served the National Museum of Australia for 3 years as a council member, deputy chair, and also acting chair. He was made a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences in 1991 and awarded an AM in 2005. Bill Gammage has written many, many books and many feature articles and research papers, but he's probably actually best known for his book, The Broken Years, Australian Soldiers in the Great War. That was his first book, and based on his PhD thesis, which he did at ANU. The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia, was released in October 2011. It won the 2012 Prime Minister's Prize for Australian History in the Prime Minister's Literary Awards, the 2011 Manning Clark House National Cultural Awards, as well as several other awards. But now, speaking about falsified history, landscape management, please give a very warm welcome to our very first speaker for the conference, Professor Bill Gammage.
Well, that was a bit of puff, wasn't it? But thanks very much, Barry, and thanks, Derek, for that welcome to country. I recognise that we are on family and clan land that was taken from Aboriginal people and is not yet paid for. And I'm going to use the phrase 1788. It's my shorthand for the time when Aborigines and outsiders, usually Europeans, met. And of course, 1788 is when they first did so at Sydney Cove, the settlers. But then there was a moving frontier of contact for the next 140 odd years. So rather than name all those years, I'll just say 1788. I argue that the people of 1788 made Australia by using fire and no fire to distribute plants, and plant distribution to locate animals, birds, reptiles and insects. I'll just say animals from now on. Fire and no fire work together to give plants and animals ideal habitats, and that made them abundant, and carefully distributing those habitats made them convenient and predictable to Aboriginal people. You could do that in Australia because most Australian plants tolerate fire, and because in Australia the only large predators to disturb prey that you'd concentrated, the only large predators were people, and because before 1788, I suspect well before, although I don't know, people developed a philosophy and a practice which protected every species. This was a mighty intellectual achievement. I see from what Duncan said that this conference has an interest in the spiritual, and so I'm going to venture to link 1788's religious philosophy to its land management. Start basically with the religious philosophy and move on to the land management later on. Essentially, a universal belief system, which we call the law today, dictated that all land and water and everything on or in them must be cared for, and it explained why. Of course, the law regulated all sorts of aspects of 1788 life, so it had myriad social implications, but it was and is built on caring for country. It's ecological. It's not secret or mysterious, but it's so remote from our farm-based thinking that it's very hard for us to comprehend. Caring for country is no casual phrase. For Aborigines, home and country are the same thing. In white Australia, we can use words like place and land and country and nation virtually interchangeably. That marks a migrant society. None of those words necessarily signify home to us newcomers. Home might still be on the far side of the world as far as we're concerned, as it was for the earlier travellers of the Australian inland. They were foreigners, predisposed to call the land arid or barren or forbidding, and to see in it a grim contrast with where they came from, usually from England. In sand dune country northwest of Birdsville in 1845, Charles Sturt wrote, "The spinifex was close and matted, and the horses were obliged to lift their feet straight up to avoid its sharp points. The ridges extended northward in parallel lines beyond the range of vision and appeared as if interminable. To the east and west they succeeded each other like the waves of the sea. The sand was a deep red colour. Mr. Brown involuntarily uttered an exclamation of amazement when he first glanced his eye over it. 'Good heavens,' said he, 'did ever man see such a country?' And yet Sturt noted a curious fact. In that desolate country were places of beauty. West of the Darling, he came on a beautiful park-like plain covered with grass, having groups of ornamental trees scattered over it. I never saw a more beautiful spot. It was, however, limited in extent, being not more than 8 miles in circumference, encircled by a line of gum trees." Now that's the language of England. The plain is park-like because it reminds Sturt of English parks. Like a park, it is limited in extent and prettily bounded. It has scattered groups of trees, which in England could only be, as Sturt put it, ornamental. And it has grass. Across the inland, grass evoked parks. On Eyre Peninsula, Edward Eyre passed through a very pretty and grass-like, park-like country. North of Glen Helen, Edgerton Warburton saw country beautiful with park-like scenery and splendid grass. In the West Petermans, Ernest Giles noted a fine piece of open, grassy country, a very park-like piece of scenery, and in bleak country north of Lake Eyre, J.W. Lewis met a plain thickly grassed and studded with fine green gum trees, most park-like in appearance. I'll come back to grass, but note how often those newcomers use park. It's a striking word. Europe's parks were made. They deliberately associated water, grass and trees in picturesque array. Few of them were public in 1788. Most were the preserve and the mark of gentry. They signified wealth and leisure. Yet, newcomers frequently compared Australia with them. In November 1826, Robert Dawson thought the country inland from Port Stephens truly beautiful. It was thinly studded with single trees, as if planted for ornament. It's impossible, therefore, to pass through such a country without being perpetually reminded of a gentleman's park and grounds. The first idea is that of an inhabited and improved country, combined with the pleasurable associations of a civilised society. In Tasmania, John Hudspeth praised the beautiful and rich valley of Jericho, more like a gentleman's park in England, laid out with taste, than land in its natural state. W.H. Lee thought the country south of Adelaide a wild but beautiful park, which reminded one of the domain of an English noble. And Alexander Buchanan considered the west side of the Murray, below the Big Bend, really most beautiful, like a gentleman's park all the way, fine plains and thinly studded with trees. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of remarks like that, and they're talking about Australia. How did those parks come about? No one asked. No one asked. They knew that English parks were made, yet they assumed that all of Australia was natural, that primitive hunter-gatherers lacked the skill and the inclination to make parks. That blindness persisted, passed down from generation to generation, and until, in time, the parks disappeared. Who today thinks of 1788 Australia as park-like? Australian history at school, if there was any, meant brave explorers risking death in harsh country to conquer the unknown. Battling and taming entered their language, their Australian words. They're the perennial perspective of the outsider. To us, the inland is still arid, plains still monotonous, dense forest still wilderness. For Aborigines, all of those places were and are country and home. When Brown asked if ever man saw such a country, man did, and woman, for at least 25,000 years in that part of the world. Country is a word Aborigines have transformed. Far from having no past and being merely land, as with us, country is communal and spiritual. It is not natural, it is made. Every rock, stream, hill and plain evokes memory and storing. Travelling with two senior men near Lake Eyre, Isabel McBride was constantly impressed by how different were the landscapes we were observing. They were observing numerous landscapes of the mind, peopled by beings from an ever-present dreaming, whose actions were marked by the features of the created landscape. They were observing a landscape mapped by stories. In this way of seeing, nothing is unmapped by stories. Nothing is wilderness. All of it must be cared for. Quote, "Wherever place we've been in," William Hovell wrote in 1824, "whether on the top of the highest mountain or in any of the deepest ravines, we always find evident marks that the natives occasionally resort to them, although there doesn't appear to be any inducement to visit these secluded places." He meant any inducement for white people, of course. Eyre observed No part of the country is so utterly worthless as not to have attractions sufficient occasionally to tempt the wandering savage into its recesses. In the arid, barren, naked plains of the north, with not a shrub to shelter him from the heat, not a stick to burn for his fire except what he carried with him, the native is found. So the driest corner is as much country as the richest park. It's a spiritual endowment far more important than any economic value which newcomers might give it. Every place is filled with presences, rights and duties, binding people for life to keep country alive. Some places mightn't be touched for years or decades, even centuries, but carers never forgot them. Sooner or later, they patrolled every corner, burning, balancing, refreshing. Now, this was a universal understanding, a continent-wide understanding, the only continent regulated by one philosophy. But it was expressed locally. Think global, act local is an apt phrase for 1788. Ted Strello well depicted the overwhelming affection felt by a native for his ancestral territory. Mountains and creeks and springs and waterholes are, to him, not merely interesting or beautiful, but the handiwork of ancestors from whom he himself has descended. He sees recorded in the surrounding landscape the ancient story of the lives and the deeds of the immortal beings whom he reveres. The whole countryside is his living, age-old family tree. The story of his own totemic ancestor is to the native the account of his own doings at the beginning of time, at the dim dawn of life, when the world, as he knows it was being shaped and moulded by all-powerful hands. He himself has played a part in that first glorious adventure, a part smaller or greater according to the original rank of the ancestor of whom he is the present reincarnated form. Guru said to me, the Ilbalincha soak has been defiled by the hands of the white men. No longer do men pluck up the grass and the weeds and sweep the ground clean around it. No longer do they care for the resting place of Korora. But it still holds me fast, and I shall tend it while I can. While I live, I shall love to gaze on this ancient soil. As Guru shows, country is managed locally by local experts. Cycles of life and season change constantly, and a carer's duty is to shepherd land and creatures safely through. This is unavoidably local, requiring knowledgeable intervention such as control burns, animal culls, food bans and ceremony. People expected help from ancestors and totems, but help hinged on knowing country. What they decided, what they knew decided how well they lived, sometimes whether they lived. Eyre noted, another very great advantage on the part of the natives is the intimate knowledge they have of every rock and corner of the country they inhabit. Does a shower of rain fall, they know the very rock where a little water is most likely to be collected, the very hole where it is longest retained. Are there heavy dews at night, they know where the longest grass grows, from which they may collect the spangles, and water is sometimes procured thus in very great abundance. Should there be neither rains nor dews, their experience at once points out to them the lowest levels where the gum scrub grows and where they are sure of getting water from the roots, with the least possible amount of labour than the method admits of, and with the surest prospect of success. The main technology for the organisation of country, Debbie Rose writes, is and was knowledge. Knowledge is country-specific, and virtually the whole body of knowledge for any given country is related to the generation of life in and around that country. In other words, it's ecological. Countries are interdependent, so it's not the case that one person's knowledge is restricted only to one country, or that countries are self-sufficient in their knowledge, But it is the case that each country has its own specificities, the knowledge of which belongs to some people and not to others. So, why people managed was spiritual and universal, but how they managed was practical and local. The land taught why, the law taught why, the land taught how. One made land care compulsory, the other made it rewarding. In their country, people lived the world of the dreaming, thronged with plants, animals and elements, each in their appointed localities. Not only obvious features which Europeans name, but every leaf and pebble disclosed the ecological logic of its existence and the dreaming's presence. West of Kununurra, Mundy told Bruce Shaw, "My other blackfella name is Munai. My father put that from the dream now. He saw the water bubbling, moving all the time while the sun shone on it. In language, you called it Munium Munium, which means light on quiet water." So law and ecology alike combine to prove the need and the reward of caring for country. Totems express this. Now, in English, totem can mean just a badge or a symbol, but to Aborigines, it is a life force stemming from and part of a creator ancestor. It's the soul that a person shares with that ancestor's plant or animal and its places and ceremonies. Totems filled the land and made it home. Every living thing, including life that Europeans introduced, like rabbits and camels and cats, houseflies, and including stars and diseases and fires, they all have at least one totem derived from a creator ancestor, otherwise they couldn't exist. Every totem has people who belong to it, and at the risk of their souls must care for it. An emu man, for example, doesn't just have emu as a mere badge. He is emu. He is emu of the same soul and the same flesh. He is of its totem, not the reverse, and he must care for emu and its habitat, and they must care for him. A man, quote, born along the track of the wallaby, might say, when seeing a wallaby, "That is me, that wallaby, that is me," or "That is my father." In March 1854, William Thomas was out with a celebrated Western Port black, Victoria, tracking 5 other blacks. The tracks had been lost some days at a part of the country where we expected they must pass. We ran down a creek. After going some miles, a bear, a koala, made a noise as we passed. The blacks stopped and a parley commenced. I stood gazing alternately at the black and the bear. At length my black came to me and said, "Me big one stupid, bear tell me no go you that way." We immediately crossed the creek and took a different track. Strange as it may appear, there's a white fella talking, we had not altered our course above 1.5 miles before we came upon the tracks of the 5 blacks and never lost them after. Almost certainly in that story, the man and the koala were the same totem, the same soul. Wenton Rabuncha's totem is from Burt Well, north of Alice Springs, because I was found there. I am boss for the maggot dreaming. My worship is maggots and witchetties and flies, and itchy grubs, those hairy caterpillars that line up, and those sawfly grubs that attach themselves in a mass to the river red gum trees. Those trees can't be cut down, or there will be lots and lots of maggots everywhere. Here in that story, at least 2 totems, the trees and the maggots, are bound to protect the river red gums, as of course are others for whom the gums are country. That's galahs and possums and bees and so on. So totems are locally specific. They depend on what plants or animals are about, but they're not geographically confined. That idea spreads over the whole of Australia. They map the continent. That's quite a trick. To meet life's variety, people have several totems, I suspect mostly from like country ecologically. So the boundaries of country are permeable. Core territory lay amid zones that were open according to totem, kin, clan, neighbour, trading partner, or occasion. Almost everyone had and has rights and interests in other countries. At New Norcia in Western Australia, each family regards one particular district as belonging exclusively to itself, as Derek explained, though the use of it is freely shared by nearby friendly families. Around Bunbury in 1841, each family had a more or less defined area of country belonging to it, a kind of heritage. Its rights over such tract were respected and any infringements regarded in the light of trespass. Even if an individual of the same tribe, yet of a different family, had occasion to cross it, he would only, if obliged at all, take just enough to appease his hunger. That is, one bird or one egg from a nest, leaving the remainder for its rightful owners. And it was wonderful to note how each knew exactly what was on their piece of land. They were never selfish about its products, but during the superabundance of any food plants or game or fish, etc., at any particular season, would send round for neighbouring families to come and make common property of what nature had so plentifully supplied. Within a family, one member might have access rights denied another, and yet neighbours would come to each other's assistance. Quote, the tribal boundary may not be crossed over without permission, but if conditions became dry within one tribal area, it's customary to offer one's tribal neighbours a section of country for hunting or a lake on which to fish, and so on. That's one thing that made it easy for Europeans to advance. Aboriginal people thought that they were helping them. People helped kin fleeing war, initiating children, or tackling big projects like fish and game drives or clean-up fires. And they came hundreds of kilometres into other people's country for seasonal harvests of the bogong, bunya, cycad, eel, and associated ceremonies. In these ways, the rights to country were spread, but, like the magic pudding, never reduced. People felt intensely for their country. It was alive. It could talk, listen, suffer, be refreshed, and rejoice. They were on it, and others were not, because they knew it, and it knew them. There their spirit stayed, there they expected to die. And no other country could ever be that. Quote, within the boundaries of their own country, as they proudly speak, James Dredge remarked in 1837, they feel a degree of security and pleasure they can find nowhere else. Here their forefathers lived and roamed and hunted, and here also their ashes rest. Even as he was dispossessing them, George Robinson, quote, the great conciliator, as he's called, confessed, the natives of Van Diemen's Land are patriots, staunch lovers of their country. Now, he meant country as nation, but in 1830 he met a man who showed what country really was. In northeast Tasmania, Manalagenna led 69 men, women and children, remnants of perhaps 800 people who'd lived there a generation before. He knew whites killed men and children and stole women. He knew Robinson's party was seeking his, although not why, and he knew soldiers were hunting for the Black Line. The military cordon bent on capturing every surviving Tasmanian was underway. He knew too that smoke would betray his small band, yet still they fired the land in the face of death, toiling to do what perhaps 10 times as many would have done a generation before. Nothing shows so powerfully how crucial land care was, how much country was heart and mind. This is no casual burning. It's a mortal duty, a levy on the souls of brave men and women. No English words, Bill Stanner concluded, are good enough to give a sense of the links between an Aboriginal group and its homeland. Our word home, warm and suggestive though it be, does not match the Aboriginal word, which may mean camp, hearth, country, everlasting home, totem place, life source, spirit centre, and much else all in one. Our word land is too spare and meagre. The Aboriginal would speak of earth and use the word in a richly symbolic way to mean his shoulder or his side. When we took what we call land, we took what to them meant hearth, home, and source and focus of life, the everlastingness of spirit. At the same time, it left each local band bereft of an essential constant that made their plan and code of living intelligible. Particular pieces of territory, each a homeland, form part of a set of constants without which no affiliation of any person to any other person, no link in the whole network of relationships, no part of the complex structure of social groups any longer had all its coordinates. The Aborigines faced a vertigo in living. They had no stable base of life, every personal affiliation was lamed, every group structure was put out of kilter. No social network had a point of fixture left. They lost all that when they lose land. No English words, Stanner says. Key Aboriginal words don't easily translate. In several Western desert languages, nura can mean a bush shelter, a house, home, country, an extent of country, or a ceremony related to any of those. East of Perth, colour meant fire, an individual's district, a property of land, and family, all the one word. How rich those words make country. What newcomer can link fire, family, land, and home in this way? Of course, none of this is written. The land was sung, commonly as the local segment of a songline. You sing the country before you burn it, Jean Yubabak says. In your mind, you see the fire, you know where it is going, and you know where it'll end. Only then do you light the fire. A songline or a storyline is the path or corridor along which a creator ancestor moved to bring country into being, and is therefore the way or the route of that ancestor's totem, the geographical expression of the songs, dances and paintings animating its country, and ecological proof of the unity of things. It narrates country and how to behave in it. Songlines are probably best explained in Ted Strello's Songs of Central Australia, one of the most important and least readable books ever written in Australia. It captures brilliantly the poetry of songlines and the economy. Strello quotes this couplet for winnowing nutgrass bulbs. With lowered heads, those yonder are holding aloft. With heads tilted sideways, those yonder are holding aloft. With typical economy, this evokes both winnowing ancestors and living women holding their coolamans high and dodging their heads to one side to shield their eyes from the dust, and also the nutgrass ready for harvest when its seed heads droop. The song ensures that even in this detail, the proper dreaming cycle continues and nutgrass habitat is maintained, reflecting the truth that the universe is made and needs ritual to maintain it. Every particle of land, sea and sky must lie on a songline, otherwise ancestors can't have created it and it can't exist. Songlines therefore threaded Australia, sometimes over thousands of kilometres. A native sack cat or quoll song went through landscape boundaries coast to coast across the continent. Another song ran from the Kimberley to the centre, south to Port Augusta, then west to Albany and probably beyond. A third went from the Kimberley to Uluru to Cairns. In 1882, Karl Lumholtz heard the same song in different languages on the Herbert River and 500 miles south at Rockhampton. Without knowing the language, people could still recognise a song because each of them had unique characteristics. In the painting, it might be the design or the colour or the symbols. In the song itself, it might be the melody or the rhythm or the pitch. There are stories of Aboriginal people not knowing language but knowing what song is being sung. To survive its continental journey, each song must, in theory, be exactly repeated in at least some of those ways because it came from the dreaming, and when it's being sung, its creator ancestor is listening and making sure it's done properly. Being conceived or born on a songline gives a person a key totem, and being taught part of that song legitimates being on the country it describes. If you can sing the country, you're entitled to be there. People learn their songs and dances and country in minute detail. From far away, they can discuss a tree or a soak and who is responsible for it. Senior people who learn more song expand their geographical and spiritual knowledge and acquire more rights to responsibilities, including the duty of singing fire or country into life, sometimes beyond their boundaries. In turn, a properly sung songs, plains and hills and rocks and waters care for its people and animals. Songlines are places of refuge, of comfort, of communion. They affirm a powerful message. The universe is one. All creation has a duty to maintain it. At the risk of your soul, keep things as they are. Now, those things are not past. People still integrate a spiritual and an ecological life. Ted Egan's brilliant lament, "Poor Fellow My Country," begins, "Once when I'm young boy, old men tell me, always look after this you country. You are a river, you are the sea, you are the rocks, boy, this your country." Eugene Numpajin's Canning Stockrib painting is titled, "Kinyu is the one that grew me up." Kinyu is the one that grew me up. Kinyu is a creator ancestor, a story and a place. These three plus Ubina add up to country. Broom's Yawaru people explain, in our law, everything comes from Bugarigara, the time when the creative ancestors traversed the country, naming the landscape, defining the languages, and setting down our rules and customs. From Bugarigara, our country is imbued with a life force from which all living things arise. It is from the country that our people, our language, our stories, and our law arise. The people, the land, and the law are three aspects of the same thing. We have a duty to look after them all, and looking after one of them means looking after the other two as well. This duty to care for country is so powerful that it's a mortal obligation, as Manalagenna and his band showed. Land care was the hardest work and the main purpose of life. With fire, people associated unlike plant communities. I'm moving now into the practical side of things. For example, they associated grass with open forest and then they laid them out in mosaics for future use. Across Australia, they linked feed plants and shelter plants for animals, and that made plants and animals abundant, convenient, and predictable. I think we newcomers generally favour trees. People then favoured grass. Grassland carried many useful plants and most animals with most meat. It was a fire break, it made seeing and travelling easier, and it confined forest, making forest resources more predictable. Almost always, grass took the best soil to lure grazing animals to the best possible feed. This meant clearing all scrub and at least most trees off soil like that. A rare European who realised this was Thomas Allen, who signed himself late Gardener to His Majesty William IV at Kew. At Port Lincoln in South Australia in June 1839, he saw that Aborigines burnt the best land, not the worst. When land is seen quite bare from burning, it is positive proof to a practical observer that the soil is of first-rate quality, but which to a superficial observer, ignorant of the circumstances and cause, would absolutely consider the best land to be a comparative desert and unfit for cultivation, a mistake that many newcomers made. Selectively burning grass or trees puts patterns on the land. On the Lachlan, surveyor George Evans wrote in 1815, "The plains are alternately on each bank of the river and nearly the same size. Opposite to the plains are woodlands. The soil on the plains is very rich and the woodlands equally so." In other words, the same riverbank soil sometimes grew grass and sometimes trees, and along and across the river they alternated, something like a chessboard. H.W. Bunbury knew that those patterns were deliberately made. By the, quote, "extensive bushfires every 2 or 3 years," he wrote in 1836, "the country is kept comparatively free from underwood and other obstructions, having the character of an open forest, through most parts of which one can ride freely. Otherwise, in all probability, it would soon become impenetrably thick. This has been proved in the case of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, where in consequence of the transportation of the natives off the mainland and the consequent absence of extensive periodical fires, the bush has grown up thick to a most inconvenient degree. It's true that we might ourselves burn the bush, but we could never do it with the same judgment and good effect as the natives, who keep the fire within due bounds, only burning those parts they wish when the scrub becomes too thick or when they have any other object to gain by it." Because people put grass on good soil, which is where trees and scrub grow naturally, we can see their hand in colonial words and paintings and survey plans depicting land. Many of them show 1788 grassland, which has now become eucalypt forest. So the obvious question to ask is, why only now? Why didn't it happen then? Some researchers think bushfire converted pre-1788 forest to grass, but after a bushfire, scrub comes back more, not less, and bushfire rarely clears big eucalypts. They resprout, as I'm sure you've seen, and they soon recover their dominance. Only repeated fire, clearing seedling and sapling for centuries until the old trees die out, converts eucalypt to grass, and only people make fire like that. This is Joseph Lycett, view of the heads, Sydney Heads, at the entrance of Port Jackson, done about 1824. That's a ship signal station that's been there for a long while, and it's possible that this house is the signal station's where the signallers live. But let's assume that this is a farm. Okay, so it's been cleared by Europeans, not natural. Nonetheless, look everywhere else where there's clear patches. North Head. There are other pictures which show this as grass, trees, grass, scrub, grass, alternating bands, a pattern we'll see again and again. Look over here, along the shoreline, the clear shoreline and the scrub, the tall trees, further back. Just off the picture there's grass at the gap. And, see this hill here? Grassy. Grass edge along here, and grass around the back. In other words, this is an unnatural pattern of grass and trees, and of course where there are no houses now, trees grow where that grassland is. In other words, this is country that's made by fire, not chance fire, but Aboriginal fire, which is skillful and deliberate. This is Eugen or Eugene von Gerard, the crater of Mount Eccles in southwestern Victoria. You can stand where von Gerard stood and you can recognise this scene today. Just keep in mind this flat plateau, this rock face, this keyhole. Now, there's the same scene, there's the keyhole, there's the plateau, it's now a car park, there's the rock face, there's the other rock face. Clearly we're in the same area, but the country is very different. The vegetation has become random and wild. These small trees here have grown up into the big trees. But most strikingly, look at this pattern, which we saw in the Sydney Heads picture, and we see it here again, alternating veins of grass and trees. Clearly the same soil, because in the next picture the trees cover all this area, and it's of course the inside of a volcano, so deliberately made. And what you could do was create this, leave it, and then say burn a patch of grass here or here or here, wait a fortnight or so until the rain brings on new growth. Australian grasses are perennial, so they'll resprout. Aborigines smell that new green growth from kilometres away. How many depends on the species. They come in and then you can ambush them from the trees on either side. If they try and go downhill, they'll hit the water. If they try and go uphill, which is more likely, they'll hit the rock face, and of course people waiting for them up there. So this is a very carefully made wallaby trap, kangaroo trap, set out for future use. In other words, preparing the landscape, making the landscape so that when it comes time to hunt, it was convenient and predictable. This is the other side of the continent, just to show we're talking about a continent-wide thing. It's Robert Dale, a section of the panoramic view of King George's Sound in Western Australia, now Albany. Done in 1832. In 1835, a settler called it a very good representation of the country. In other words, a very accurate depiction. And it shows a classic 1788 pattern for grazing animals. You can see grass, tree clumps or belts beside water, and also you can possibly see there's small fires. They're not big fires, they're small controlled fires. They are making the country. They are creating the grasslands and leaving the tree clumps. Some of this is now thick forest where there's a golf course or parts of a golf course. So trees can grow in those places, but Aboriginal people were making sure they didn't. And Dale said that kind of pattern extends over the rest of his painting, which goes all the way around King George Sound and into the inland. As he's put it, they reach to the utmost bound of sight. On the West Australian South Coast, grazier Lou Scott recorded the 1920s. Native grass in those days, you don't see it now because it's not burnt. You have to burn to get native grass. You'd light it up at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and 3 or 4 o'clock it would all go out. The next day you'd light it up again. The bush was alive with possums and wallabies and kangaroo rats. The fire only went slowly. It was only a little fire. It never used to get up in the trees and burn the possums. The real oldies followed the burning patterns of the natives in keeping the place green, learnt to burn little patches that they wanted for their existence, the same as the blackfellow. Of course, not winter and not spring, because you kill all the little birds and animals. And so summer burning. Try summer burning now. What about Queensland? This is Frederick Montague Rothery, the ups and down blocks on Bundalia Station in 1877. Bundalia is on the New South Wales border between the Warrego and the Colgoa. It was taken up about 18 1861 and grew to over 1,000 square miles, which was divided into blocks. In 1877-78, Rothery, the manager, drew a plan of each block. He described ups and downs, which is 100 square miles, this one, as thick belts of gidgee, scrub, pine, bigelow and small scrub with broken plains scattered all through, with open coolabah flats. That's pretty well typical of the rest of Bundleer. Rothery linked in detail each species to its soil type, a common way to associate soils and trees. Yet this can't explain this particular distribution so erratic. Soil might suggest which tree species might occupy ancient grassland, but it doesn't explain why no trees at all are there. Brigalow and gidgee are in here and here. They're in clumps or lanes, belts, and everywhere you can see grass and scrub alternating. At centre left there's a village in there, and it has a beautiful open vista down to the creek, Nebine Creek. Presumably an Aboriginal village, because there's no white occupation anywhere near there. So people in the village have given themselves a nice view, as well as patterning the country to diversify the plants and the animals that use it. That pattern vanished very quickly. In 1886, that's what, eight years later, a report stated, Brigalow is spreading very much and taking possession of most of the flats. A great portion of the country that is now open will be dense Brigalow scrub in 5 or 6 years, and the pasture will deteriorate considerably. Brigalow is also invading the gidgee and other parts of the country, and new weeds, particularly Buddha or false sandalwood, had become common. In 1910, another inspector said the best grasses, cotton and saltbush, have been almost destroyed by drought, heavy stocking and rabbits, and yet even in the wet periods, grass and saltbush were decreasing on this block and scrub was increasing. After 1886, the station managers put in a century of ring barking, pulling and burning to control trees, but still the Brigalow and the Buddha expanded. They admitted that attempts to clear the sandalwood country have invariably resulted in its thick degeneration. By 1985, a ground survey found almost all the saltbush gone, much less grass, much more Brigalow and gidgee, and much more Buddha, even though the station was still pulling and burning in the 1980s and 1960s. In other words, once Aboriginal control was ended, nothing that white people did stopped the grass being recaptured by various native scrub trees. This is a bald on Mount Moberlin in the Bunya Mountains. I'm sure many of you have been here. Moberlin means bald head, in other words, the bald top of a hill. The head of Moberlin is rainforest now. In general, in 1788, people cleared forest patches or plains along water, crests or slopes to camp, lure or hunt. Clearing patches was universal. In Tasmania and the southeast, most of those clearings face north to east. In warmer zones, where they're called balds, B-A-L-D-S, they face south to west. Everywhere, Stephen Simpson wrote near Moberlin in 1843, even on the summit of the mountain, the abundance of grass and fine timber give the country a pleasing aspect. And on the Mary River, he noted, the country gradually opens out into some beautiful flats of the richest description, mainly clear of timber. Most of those places are now scrub. This particular ball faces south to the winter sun. Reversing what was happening on the Mary River flats, forest red gum now fills its base. That's this tree here. And rainforest is pushing up slope, up both sides. You can see a few bunya pines on the skyline, but very few. But balls are common in bunya country because of the great bunya festivals held when the pines cropped heavily about every 3 years, and that brought thousands of people in to feast. Their host had to feed them on more than nuts, and so they made these balls to increase and vary plant and animal food. Then they chose which balls to use for a particular feast, and each of them had a name so that they could be easily followed. Simpson went through a bunya scrub called Hawa to a beautiful place called Dungali, well watered by a fine creek and waterholes. On the borders of the plain were fine ridges of open forest land, and behind them scrubs in almost every direction. In fact, this plain seems to be the very heart of bunya country. He crossed many high grassy ridges to reach extensive flats, which he called Toon, and said that that was owned and cared for by one family. Early governments knew how important this bunya country was, quote, to secure the natives in their enjoyment of their triennial banquet. The colonial government has prohibited the felling of the bunya tree, and stations are not allowed to be planted nor stock run on the bunya country. This didn't last, of course. Each year bullocks rested here, and the foreground whipstick eucalypts recapturing grassland shows how recently they've left. So what we've got here is an area that was all grass. You can see the grass comes right down here, but Aboriginal fire has been stopped, and so the eucalypts can recapture the grassland, they can reseed the grassland, and under their cover the rainforest will ultimately come back, and in 400 or 500 years the eucalypts would die out. So this is a made bald which eucalypts are recapturing the edges of, and ultimately would give way, go back to rainforest, which is what it was originally. And of course that has to be made. There's no way that you could have rainforest being converted to grass by a natural process. That puzzled, these balls puzzled a lot of scientists, and they still do. People researching them couldn't exactly explain how it was that they come about, because it took them a long while to drop to the fact of Aboriginal fire. D.A. Herbert said that he was puzzled over balls. He said, on the lower slopes the eucalypts are not aged trees, just as here. They would thus appear to represent a returned forest rather than one that was originally there. He concluded that fire made them, and also he reported that great areas of coastal Queensland, great areas, formerly savanna, open, have, following protection from fire, become reclothed with trees. In Brisbane, One Tree Hill, which is now heavily forested, was open savanna. That the balls have had trees in the past is shown by the fact that roots can be dug up. In 1995, Rod Fensham and Russell Fairfax from Queensland surveyed 61 bunya balls and assessed 73 others from the air. Where Herbert invariably found open grassland on slopes and tops of bald hills backed by a solid wall of rainforest, Fensham and Fairfax found that by 1991, eucalypts and other trees occupied about 30% of what were balls in 1951. They concluded that balls could not be explained by anything but 1788 fire. In other words, people are saying that in the higher rainfall areas of Queensland, which is a huge area, forest is recapturing country that Aboriginal people made grass. Elsewhere in Queensland, in the drier country, Ludwig Leichhardt saw a similar phenomenon. He wondered why on the same soil the plants suddenly changed. He was a changeologist, and yet at Calvert's Plains on the Dawson River in November 1844, he wrote, "It's interesting to observe how strictly the scrubs kept to the sandstone and to the stiff loam lying upon it, whilst the mild black whinstone or basalt soil was without trees and covered with luxuriant herbs and grasses. And this fact struck me as remarkable because during my travels in the Bunyan country, or Moreton Bay, I found it to be exactly the reverse. The sandstone spurs of the range being there covered with an open well-grass forest, while a dense vine scrub covered the basalt." In other words, in some places the basalt's clear, and in other places it's covered with dense scrub, and the same was true of the sandstone. It took Leichhardt a while to realise, but he finally glimpsed why, at least, and he famously said, "The natives seem to have burnt the grass systematically along every watercourse and around every waterhole, in order to have them surrounded with young grass as soon as the rain sets in. These burnings were not connected with camping places where the fire is liable to spread from the fireplaces and would clear the neighbouring ground. Long strips of lately burnt grass were frequently observed extending for many miles along the creeks. The banks of small isolated water holes in the forest were equally attended to, although water had not been in either for a considerable time. It's no doubt connected with a systematic management of their runs to attract game to particular spots in the same way that stockholders burn parts of theirs in the proper seasons." 1911, another scientist found very sharp edges between the grass and the forest. "The line of demarcation between them is most distinct," he said, "a phenomenon which is unique in the whole world." He saw that in medium rainfall and in low rainfall lancewood scrub. And he again decided it has to be Aboriginal burning that did something like that. You can see it also on the Queensland coast. This is James Cobban, a survey plan north of Cowie Point on Cape York, one of several similar plans along the east coast of Cape York and showing a similar pattern. Here, green is the rainforest, white is open eucalypt forest. I've touched up the original survey plan. And Cobban had to certify, quote, "on honour," that his plan was accurate, and yet, as you can see, every vegetation type is on every terrain. This is eucalypt forest. Here, on this creek, you've got rainforest higher up and open eucalypt forest lower down. You'd expect it to be the other way round, if anything, but there it is. You've got rainforest as a shield along the coast, so that women and children on the beach are shielded from the hunting grounds. Same soil, sometimes on hills, sometimes on flats, but different vegetation. Look up here. Here's a swamp. Two sides are rainforest and two sides are eucalypt forest, and yet it's clearly the same soil and on the same level. Europeans found these patterns. They thought they'd be good for crops, usually tobacco, but without repeated fire, this land becomes dense rainforest, and that's what it is now. If you have a look on Google Earth, you'll see this is all rainforest country now. A fire and no fire made all this possible. Not fire as newcomers know it, a fiend to be feared, but fire as an ally. There was fire stick farming, which you may know of, patch burning grass to bring on fresh growth to lure grazing animals. We saw that at Mount Eccles. Aborigines themselves explained at Evans Bay near Torres Strait in 1849, observing that the grass had been burnt on portions of the flats, the blacks said that the rain that was coming on would make the young grass spring up, and that would bring down the kangaroos, and the blacks would spear them from the scrub. There are many other fire types, not just fire stick farming. Big, little, hot, cool, patch burns, back burns, sheet burns, changes in extent, frequency, timing and thus intensity according to season, purpose and circumstance. Very few newcomers have dropped to this, reflecting how blind we are about managing fire. We miss how much it depends on planning and preparation. To think that fire stick farming is all people did in 1788 is like confusing burning sugarcane with farming sugar. 1788 Australia, nonetheless, had a great weakness. A scant and scattered population made it vulnerable to invasion and destruction. But this shouldn't mask how impressive its achievement was. To maintain and balance country so richly for so long across so great an area ranks among humanity's great achievements. No other world civilization managed it. Almost all of them turned from hunter-gathering to agriculture and thence in time to a bad end or an uncertain future such as ours. Aborigines never joined the agrarian world's race to a complex technology. There are many instances of farming in 1788, but people were never likely to convert to it, never likely to depend on it. Fire gave them too many advantages. It let people fuse the ecology and religion of an entire continent into the biggest estate on earth, and instead of dividing Aborigines into gentry and peasantry, remember the parks, it made them a free people. Thank you. I'll finish there.